Hi, I'm Nick Birmingham and welcome to part 2 of my video on how to make the medieval style arrow bag. To make the cloth bag I chose a heavy weave linen which looks authentic and is strong enough not to be pierced by the arrowheads. I went for a sandy beige colour simply because every archer seems to go for cream and I wanted mine to be slightly different. Before we begin cutting, we need to work out 3 measurements: the width of the material, marked as A, the length, B, and the point where the arrow spacer will sit, C. To find the width of the material, measure the circumference of the arrow spacer using a fabric tape measure. In my case, this measured 21.5 inches. I then added an extra inch to this measurement to give myself enough fabric to sew the 2 edges of the bag together, giving a total of 22.5 inches. To find the length, I measured my longest arrow, adding 4 inches at the bottom for enough space to create a hem and tie the bag closed, and 4 inches at the top so I had enough to create a channel for a drawstring and to ensure that when the bag was drawn closed it covered all the arrows. This worked out at 44 inches. While measuring the length, I positioned the arrow spacer at the height I wanted so that it would hold the arrows without touching the fletchings. This worked out at 29 inches from the bottom, which gave me measurement C. I could now go ahead and mark the width and the length with some tailor's chalk before cutting the sheet to size. I now needed to join the 2 edges together to create the tube of the bag like so. And to do this I folded each edge over by ½ inch, starting at the bottom and working up to the point where the spacer would sit. To fix each fold before I pinned the edges together, I used a hot iron to steam them in place. I then brought the edges together and pinned them, then turned the bag inside out so I could sew the fold together on the inside so the stitches wouldn't be seen. Using a darning needle and some heavy duty linen thread, I then sewed the seam together using a back stitch so there would be no chance of the seam coming apart as a result of the heavy wear and tear it was likely to get. Once the bag was turned the right way out again, I was left with a nice neat seam without any stitching visible. The next step was to tidy up the edges of the opening flaps, so I folded each edge over and created a hem, this time using a blind stitch because the hem would be visible from both sides and I wanted the stitching to be as invisible as possible. Now that the sides were hemmed, I could go ahead and create the channel for the drawstring along the top, and I did that simply by folding the top over once to create a clean edge and then folding it down again by about 1 inch, leaving a large enough gap for the drawstring. I then sewed along the bottom edge of the channel using a blind stitch as before. It was now time to insert the spacer, so I turned the bag inside out and drew a line across the bag with tailor's chalk to mark where the spacer would go so I could sew it in level. I then turned the bag the right side out, pushed the spacer inside, and following the chalk line I looped a few stitches through the side of the bag and at each of the small holes around the edge, tying off the thread at each hole. Most people just use one length of thread to sew all the holes at the same time, but I decided to sew each hole individually so that if the thread ever broke then it wouldn't affect every hole. When I started this project, I planned to close the bottom of the bag simply by wrapping some cord around it and tying it shut. But after making the drawstring closure at the top, I changed my mind and decided to do the same at the bottom. If you remember at the start when I joined the cloth into a tube, I sewed the edges together from the very bottom, and so before I could make the channel for the drawstring, I had to cut this join open again for about the first 2 inches. I then folded the end over to create the channel in exactly the same way as I did at the top. With the body of the bag now complete, it was time to add the drawstrings, and for these I chose some beige coloured 4mm polyester cord. To keep the ends tidy and stop them fraying, I added brass aglet points, which I glued and crimped in place. The only job remaining was to come up with a way of carrying the bag. It's unclear whether archers actually carried arrow bags on their person. There are many illustrations that show archers with a few arrows tucked into their belts. But this is the only illustration I've ever seen of anything resembling a bag actually being worn. There are 16th century references to arrow sheaths being supplied with girdles with hangings, so I decided to go down that route and create a pair of belt loops so the bag could be worn horizontally at my waist. This was achieved by cutting a couple of rectangles of linen measuring 7 inches by 12 inches, folding over the edges, then folding the whole piece in half along the longest edge and simply sewing them to the side of the bag. Once a thin belt was run through them and tied to the waist, it seemed to work fairly well. And so here we have the finished bag, at first closed, and then opened with the flaps pulled down the side of the bag and tied together. And then to finish off, here is a shot of the bag actually being used. If you want to know what I think of the finished bag, and what I might do differently, along with my thoughts on how arrows were drawn from them, then please read the video details.